Welcome to Leadership and Life Chat with your hosts, me, Becky Ames.
And me, Mark Curtis. In each episode, we'll be illustrating how success in leadership is inextricably linked with success in life.
Whether it's leadership in business, society, family or friends, we're all leaders.
Using our experiences and a range of expert guests, we'll share secrets to boosting your health, wealth and self.
So let's get on with the show. In this week's episode, we were joined by Nick Jonsson, world-leading expert, advising leaders on how to deal with loneliness. This topic is challenging, and some of our discussions were really open and honest. So just a warning, there are references to suicide and depression during the episode. So, Nick Jonsson, welcome to the show. First of all, for our listeners, as always, it would be really helpful if you could give us an insight into your journey and, a bit about your background, please.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the show and for covering such an important topic as we will today. So a brief intro of myself. I was born in Sweden, educated in Australia, and then I lived and worked the last 20 years in Southeast Asia, mainly in Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. So I worked my way up there in the corporate ladder, but these days, though, I have left the corporate world and I'm running confidential peer groups for senior executives and business owners here in Asia. So it's really for them to have a safe space where they can discuss the challenges that they are facing on a day-to-day basis. So that's what gets me out of bed. And also what keeps me out of the office is triathlon. I'm an age group athlete in Ironman, top 1% world in 2021. So I get very excited about that.
Wow. That's I don't know where to start with that. So all those countries you've lived in, you've been in Asia for quite some time now, and really why we're here today is to talk about what you do now and how that came about. So could you explain to our listeners what led you to what you do now, really?
Absolutely. So working as an expatriate away from Europe, for 20 years is a long time away from your family, friends, your social system. You're working in countries where there's a new language, new cultures, new legal system. So naturally, you can feel a bit isolated. You can feel a little bit lonely. If you think that you can be lonely in your own country, then when you're living and working abroad, that feeling can be even more immense. So these days I'm passionate about acknowledging this, and rather than putting on a show myself and others, I'm there to create a support system for them where we can discuss that. And what I'm saying here is not only that my network is for expatriates, it's also for the locals in these countries, and the mix is about half-half, because I also can learn a lot from all the regional head and the people working then for the big multinationals and so on in Asia. So that's a little bit of what I'm doing.
Mark and I know that the reason you have ended up doing what you're doing is for very personal reasons, and your personal experiences of experiencing that executive loneliness, both through working abroad, but also feeling the pressure of, a senior position. Can you explain to us your backstory there in terms of how that affected you and what it led to?
Yeah, and I think all of us are going through ups and downs in life, and perhaps many of us men have the 40 years crisis, and it hit me also. And again, going back to what I said before, that when you are abroad, you are so exposed, you don't have the social system there. For example, if you lose your employment, then you might lose your housing, your work permit, and your status to even be in that country. It might be that you are laid off and you need to exit the country within 30 days. And if you lived in that country for 5-6 years, all your friends and everything is there, it's like you're losing everything overnight. And I found myself in that space a few times. Early on in my career, perhaps I was driving a bit too hard sometimes and I got terminated, while other times also I was terminated because the company went through a merger acquisition. So while I thought I was performing well, overnight I was let go along with others. And I wasn't ready for this, despite being aware about it. I really loved my job. The last job I was laid off in 2015, and it was really hard on me. And then my son was 5 years age then, and that meant we had to pull him out of the school because the international school was tied to my employment and so on. And all the anxiety and so on that I was going through then, instead of asking for help. I pushed everyone I loved away, and it led to my divorce. It led to me resigning from my next job I got because I was too insecure. And then I found myself completely isolated, and I also lost my good habits, the exercise routines and the diets and so on at this place, replacing it with fast food and going to the bar and drinking beer. And before I knew it, a bad habit turned into an addiction. And eventually, fast forward to 2018, I found myself at rock bottom, and I didn't know how to get out. I really thought that life was over for me.
Wow. I mean, there's so many aspects there that we can pick up on. I mean, first of all, it had never occurred to me that, and it makes sense, that if you're working overseas, then absolutely your residence, your schools, everything is so intrinsically linked, isn't it? And that is so fragile, I guess, in terms of it can come to an end so quickly, and even living with that pressure must be a massive thing. But you said there that 2018 you reached an absolute low. And I know from reading on your website and things that you sought help at that point, didn't you? And you're very open about how you went through the 12-step program. Is that correct? And managed to regain your physical and mental health. Not an easy task at all, but then again, you're very open on your website and in your book and things about how a tragedy then made you really reassess again and think about how you went forwards.
Yeah, absolutely. But it took me a few years before I was open and before I dared to speak up about it. So while it was 2015, I started sort of to spiral down and losing the grip of life. It was only 2018 when I decided to speak up. And what happened then was I met a new woman who's today my wife. And I decided to tell her. We had just gotten married 3 weeks before, and I was keeping it all, playing this game, acting like everything is fantastic. But for some reason, I decided just to tell her how I felt internally, and she was quite shocked. And she immediately pulled me to the doctor and shared my story to the doctor. And then after that, she took me to one of the common friends we had who'd gone through a 12-step program earlier, who now had recovered and had some tips. So within sort of 48 hours, I was completely exposed. So they say that, you're only as sick as your secrets. And that was really me. For those 3 years, 2015 to 18, I kept all of this secret, trying to play the game, acting like everything is well, but not telling anyone, no one whatsoever, even my parents, my family, my friends. What they could see on social media and so on was, selected images of who I was and what was happening. There was times when I couldn't hold it together, and people were starting to wondering, is Nick all right? And then I was just in complete denial, and that is what is the most common in this. And it doesn't matter if you're an expatriate, or if you're losing your job in your home country, or if you're falling sick, or the whole point there is the isolation, that if you don't speak up, then no one is there, no one can help you. And they're also the saying there that a problem shared is a problem halved, and that's what happened to me immediately. I had a V-shaped recovery as soon as I was just exposed.
Yeah, it's almost like Becky and I have been in business for 30 years as our careers have developed, and I think the one thing that we've both found is that loneliness is a massive thing as you go through your career, and that as you climb that slippery pole, there's less and like the triangle, there's less and less people at your level. There's less and less people you're probably interacting with on a daily basis at a deeper level. It's more superficial relationships with the team and such like, and it's easier to start getting isolated if you're not careful, because your peer group tends to shrink. And we've talked about this on podcasts before, Becky. Your friendship groups change as well as you go through your career. So maybe the strong friendship networks you had when you were younger, they start to change, because maybe you don't even have to move country. People have children, some people don't have children. The dynamics change, and you start to suddenly think, well, actually, if I have to ask for help here, it's a sign of weakness. And it's almost like that fear of actually speaking out, because it's like, well, I should be able to deal with this. I'm X years old. I'm in this position in business. I should be able to deal with this. And then you become even more insular, because it's like, well, if I ask for help, it looks weak, and you just run into a real vicious circle if you're not careful. I think that's probably the experience I've found in leadership.
Yes, absolutely. And I talk a lot about vulnerability. And even if you look in the dictionaries today, if you look up Cambridge or Wikipedia, Oxford Learners, the word vulnerability is still associated with being easily hurt, attacked, being exposed, harmed, or weak, you know. So, still, the mindset of people and even the dictionaries is that vulnerability is a negative thing. And this is what I'm hoping that today with this podcast that we can sort of change this perception there, that it's not a source of weakness to share that we have some challenges. It's a strength to expose yourself and asking for help. And that fundamental shift is something that hasn't happened yet. And that's the whole point. And that's why I wrote the book. And that's the message that I'm trying to hammer home, that we need to change this.
And Nick, at any point prior to making the change, did you think this is just how it is? This is how, when you reach a certain point, this is how you feel. This is how you have to manage the stress that working at this level is. Was it kind of like you just have to get on with it?
Yeah, and if I'm looking back 25 years ago when I was at the university in Australia, I can remember the first day of business school, the dean was playing a video, and it was athletes performing, they were playing a World Cup football game, and the winners got a big trophy and they were cheering and so happy. And then the losers, the silver medalists, they were crying and walking off the pitch. And what he said, why don't we approach our studies and our working life like this? And he said, the number two is the first loser. Here at this university, we favor the people who top the classes. These are the scholarships we have. We want to be the top 10 university in the world, and this was the message he hammered to me. And that resonated with me 25 years ago. And I did work as hard as I could to get some of those awards. But then I brought that with me, that mindset, into the workplace. And that means that you're elbowing your way up. You're stepping on people's toes because you want to impress the bosses and you want to get ahead. And it's about me getting the recognition and not your colleagues. And that is, again, something that is, I'm glad to say that is slowly changing, but there's still more work to be done here.
Yeah, I completely agree. Mark was saying about your close friendships do shift anyway in life, don't they? But particularly, I think when you're working in stressful roles, whatever they may be, I think if people can't relate, or you feel they can't relate to you as well, then you don't feel you have those outlets, do you? And the constant pressure to, well, everyone else is okay, so I should be able to deal with this anyway, is really challenging, isn't it? I know on your website, in your book, Nick, you've been very open about the fact that a friend committed suicide, and that really prompted you to shift your career, I think, and actually make this your purpose in terms of what you now do. And again, that was a male who hadn't felt able to speak out.
That's right. So I was then 1 year into recovery myself. So this is 2019. I had been exposed to a small circle, the 12-step program, the doctor, my wife, a few people in my close circle knew what I'd gone through, but the most people didn't know. And I was still doing everything I could to protect this from leaking out. I didn't want people to know that I was going to an anonymous support group for that reason. But that all changed when Simon then suddenly was gone one day in 2019. I was in shock, and I called his brother, who still lives in the UK. So Simon was an expatriate in Singapore, working in the recruitment space, and I just couldn't believe what had happened. Because Simon was someone who was full of life. He just come back from Mount Everest, where he had climbed up to the base camp, something which was his dream to do. He had a girlfriend he loved. He was posting social media images saying that he's never been happier in his life. So he had everything going for him, and I was working with him on projects, and I know that he had a lot of exciting things going on. But what no one knew was that there was something going on behind the scene that he did not share. And still today, we don't know what it was that was on his mind. But when he was gone then, and again with the permission of his brother, I asked if I could make an attempt here to set this right. And his brother said, sure, go ahead. Simon would have loved this, and scream it loud. That's what he said. And I was so determined then, still in shock, that I set up my video and I did a video clip, and I started a charity fund then to raise basically awareness about isolation, and also to raise funds for a suicide fund in Singapore. And that video clip I posted on LinkedIn back in 2019, and I went out for a bike ride after I posted it with a bit of honor sharing. And when I came back, I couldn't understand what was going on. My whole phone was full of messages on all channels. There was 200 messages on LinkedIn, and the post had gone completely viral all around the world. Radio was calling me, asking me to come live on radio. TV wanted to interview me. Organizations wanted me to come and talk about it. And I was just blown away. What's this big interest about someone talking a little bit of honest truth here, that it's okay to not be okay? So that was the complete change. And because of all the interviews and all the media exposure and so on that happened then, and the attention to this topic, and all the journalists said, we are so grateful that someone here wants to have an honest conversation. We're trying to run these stories, but no one wants to step forward. We can run the story anonymously, but we need real people. And I was then willing to be that real person. And from there on, I started to write my book after that, because I realized that I was talking about something that people were not comfortable doing.
Yeah, and we've come across this in our own business with the mental health training that we've had as senior people in the business. And one of the things which really stood out for me as part of that training was the fact that we all superficially ask each other, "Oh, are you okay? Did you have a good weekend?" But we don't really mean it. We're just making idle chatter with people, and all we really want people to say is, "Yeah, I had a fantastic weekend. You had a great evening." And we don't really want people to say to us, "Do you know what? I'm really struggling at the moment. I had a terrible weekend. I've been sitting in isolation. I've had, suicidal thoughts, whatever it might be." And we don't really ask the questions because we want the proper answer. And one of the things which stood out for me in that training was that. But also the second thing was ask the person twice, because if you ask them the first time, you get the superficial answer, which is what they think you want to hear. If you ask them the second time, was the weekend really okay? Then there's a better chance that you're going to get an honest answer, because they think you're really, really asking the question that time. Do you sort of have any thoughts around that kind of thing?
Absolutely, and we need a structure for this, and that's why the 12-step programs, they do this so well. Typically a 12-step program will start perhaps 15-20 people sitting in a circle. You go around and introducing yourself and saying the one thing you are grateful for today. That's the first thing. So you start on a positive note, and everyone break the ice a little bit by that. But then you normally dig into a topic. There could be a reading 2-3 pages about something, and then the sharing starts, and all the sharings is honest. And if you listen to many of celebrities, sports stars who have come into these recovery groups, they say they're completely shocked. For the first time, they can sit listening to 1 hour to honest conversations and understand that they're not the only one going through difficult times. And that's the whole thing we need as human beings. We need that sympathy. We need to hear that what you've gone through, what you are going through, you're not alone. And they're in that circle of people who've gone through it before. And that's the recognition that I had. Because when I came in then at my rock bottom, and I didn't know how to get out of it, there were people who were 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, even someone with 30 years sobriety, for example, who had worked the program. And the 12-step, by the way, in every 12-step program is to give it back. You have to give it back to keep the gift of recovery. So that means that people have to come back. So that's how it works in the 12-step programs. And also, if I'm looking at our confidential peer groups, that's the whole format. That's how it works. And some of our groups also start by sharing something you're grateful for. But we also then take turns. The members can put themselves in an advisory board or a hot seat, where they will, with our moderator, have prepared a few slides when they go up and present something. It can be a major conflict in their team. It can be a breakdown, something that they are not really sure about. Can be a major challenge from the boss or perhaps the owners or the board. They're going to give a presentation next week and fly to head office, and they're full of panic and fear. They don't know. They then can even go up and present these slides and say, "Here, this is what I have, but I'm stuck here. Can you help me?" And then the whole group sort of work on that. So we're practicing here the vulnerability muscle, where all the people feel comfortable and feeling instant rewards. Oh, I opened up and I can leave this meeting with solutions. So that's the whole point of our business model and what we do.
We had a previous guest on, Daryl Stickle, who it was all about building trusting relationships. And and there's a common theme coming through here, and vulnerability was a massive part of his equation. That as a leader, you had to display vulnerability to build trust with the team around you. And it sounds from what you were saying there, Nick, that actually, if we could almost be trained to say and have permission to say it's okay to be vulnerable as we're coming through our leadership careers, rather than get to this point where vulnerability is almost seen as a weakness rather than a strength. If we could just embed that kind of culture, it could make a massive difference to how people are really feeling inside, not just to trust within the team, but also trust for yourself. You don't feel you need to be this fake version of yourself anymore. You can be vulnerable, you can be more who you really are, which has got to be, it's easier to be who you are than trying to pretend you're somebody else, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. And I've been trying my very best to build the company culture of my current company in this way. We are about 40 employees now, everyone working remotely, and we've done that for the last couple of years, even before the pandemic. And we have done a few things. One is that we have fail fast policies where people are encouraged to speak up when they made a mistake or they made something that didn't go right, and then we repackage it so they can share what they learned from it. And even part of the budgets that, for example, the marketing team has, certain percentage of that budget is called experiment budget, for the reason that they shouldn't be scared to try something new, and instead we're looking at what did we learn from this exercise rather than expecting everything to go right. So if we have this culture, then it's more easy to be vulnerable. And I'm constantly trying my best. It was a couple of times today when the staff naturally come to me. I'm the boss, so they come and ask me, what should I do with this? That's normally what they would ask, and I say, what do you think? Can you come back and give me 2-3 suggestions, and let's talk about it in our next weekly meeting, unless there's something that is very urgent, then we can jump on a call now. But I'm looking forward to hearing, what do you think we should do? So you pass it back to them, they feel engaged, and then we together can make a decision. And there's no one shooting each other if it doesn't go right. It's just life.
Yeah, I imagine the culture in Singapore and other areas where people go to work in very high-powered, very well-paid roles, but the culture must be very different. And to have this safe place where you can go must be hugely valuable. And you said that it's not just the expats that are part of your groups, that it is local people as well. So that's intriguing, isn't it? That you recognise that there was a need for this, but it clearly is far beyond simply, because you live in another country, you have this challenge. It's endemic to the whole thing.
Yes, absolutely. And it started a few years ago by mainly being expats, but then, the locals were wondering what's going on here, and people were coming into the offices having breakthroughs, new ideas and talking about it, and they were curious. So we really did some recruitment drives to get locals aboard, and of course, it also opens up the eyes for them and open up new career opportunities and so on. So in that sense, it's been a blessing for everyone around. And we have, by the way, just opened up the first peer groups in Jakarta, Indonesia last year. And that's a country with 280 million people. And we are the first peer network company to enter the market. We have already 5 groups with about 150 members, and Jakarta have almost 30 million people. So you can imagine the potential here, and the vocabulary of having mastermind groups or peer groups and so on was something that they didn't even understand. We had to spend 1 hour telling the journalists what it is we're trying to do, because the concept of asking for help was just so new.
I think it's really interesting, because I was part of a peer network group in the UK, Vistage, which is not just UK, I appreciate. And whilst that was similar in context in terms of it was a safe place, like-minded people, that you could bring your challenges and use the experience of the room, it wasn't promoted from the premise of, it's okay to speak up, it's okay to not be okay. It was very much about developing your leadership skills and your business skills and building your network. So it's a similar group concept, but presented in a very different way. And I think that's what distinguishes what you do from existing groups internationally, I imagine.
Yes, absolutely. And the groups in Singapore were run by a predecessor before, who ran it very similar like Vistage, keeping it very professional. It might be that the leader of the network is not comfortable being vulnerable, and I would not have been comfortable either before I started to open up. So now when I'm leading this network, I've seen the opportunity to bring in vulnerability in it, and it has resonated with a lot of people, not with everyone. So for some people, they have felt this is too much for me. I want to not involve my personal life or my challenges to this extent. It could be competitors in the room, maybe rumors are spreading, but we're trying everything we can to protect it here by writing non-disclosure agreements. We have no competitors in the same room and so on. So we're trying to do the housekeeping and say this is a serious meeting, and respect the confidentiality, and then setting the scene. And that was what I did with my book then, and sharing my story, because if I share my story, and then others hopefully will be influenced, and they will also dare to share their story, which they do.
I was just reflecting on the conversation, and I just scribbled a couple of things down. It's almost like, culturally, certainly in the UK, and you're going to be far more worldwidely than me, Nick, with your travels around the globe. Because I was thinking at the start, we are polar opposites. I was born in Norfolk, I live in Norfolk, and I've worked in Norfolk, and I'm probably in the bottom 1% of athletic ability for my age range. So we're probably polar opposites here. But the one thing which we probably all go through is a schooling system where we're not encouraged to speak out or be part of a team, because ultimately you sit an exam and it's all based on what you achieve in that exam. Becky and I are accountants by trade, so we've sat our professional exams 25 years ago. Again, you're sitting in an exam hall, it's just about it's what you do in that 3 hours on that piece of paper. You're just judged on your performance alone. We get into the real world, and it's not about your performance, it's about the team's performance, it's about your interaction with other human beings. So it's almost like culturally, all of the systems we tend to run through, certainly in the UK, push us down a road of competing against we're competing against ourselves. It's about isolation. It's not promoting the wider teamwork. And then we get into the work environment and we go for promotions. So it's like, if my colleague wins and I lose, I lose. We can't both win in this situation. So when you start kind of thinking about it from a wider lens, it doesn't, it's no wonder we end up with isolation and loneliness as people progress their careers, because most of the conditioning we've had as we've grown through our lives has led us to be quite insular because of the systems we've come through.
Yes, absolutely, and especially senior executives and perhaps CEOs and so on. There is a reason why they are at the top, and I always also talk about anxious overachievers, because I was one myself. Because I was anxious, I worked so hard. That meant perhaps that I didn't have as much life as some others, because for me, delivering the best result, it may be at university or at work, was more important to me. So I didn't necessarily have a life, not as much as now. That's why I'm so aware about this now, and why since I came back from my recovery in 2018, I fill my diary every day way in advance. So now it's filled all the way until end of the year with the time I have for exercise, meditation, and those kind of things. And half of all the exercise I do, like cycling, swimming, running, is by myself. So I have that as my meditation, my self-care time. The rest is with running clubs, swim academies, cycling groups, to force myself to go out and socialize with different groups from different nationalities and so on. Because otherwise my natural go-to will be, if it's not in the calendar, not protected, then I just work, then I just deliver and trying to make money. Because again, the insecurities, what about, do I have enough for my pension? What about if this company doesn't work out? You're playing all those scenarios in your head, and you just sit there working. That's my default, and I have to break out of that, and I do that by being aware.
And that's the key, isn't it? You had to become aware of that so that you could do something about it. And I think whatever level you're working at, but if you don't have that awareness, then it's very easy to just continue as you are, not stop, shift, do anything different, isn't it? And that's a real danger. I mean, in terms of you've been very open, Nick, about how your behaviours displayed themselves in terms of you were reliant on alcohol. You leaned on alcohol. How else might we recognise this in other people and other leaders, and maybe be able to spot the signs, perhaps?
Well, it could be alcohol, it can be drugs, social media, sex, shopping, gambling, if I didn't say that. It can be all these kind of addictions that are going around, and one can lead to another. That's something we hear. And the common factor is that we all deny it, right? We do everything to protect our addiction, we do everything to not be exposed. So that's sort of some of the issues there. And what I learned and how you can find out more is, if people isolate themselves and if perhaps some habits change. If you live with a partner who gain or lose a lot of weight or change the patterns, if for 15 years you have a pasta night every Wednesday, suddenly they don't want to cook, or if your partner always used to play the guitar, they stop, then look for those signs. So in my case, I was scared to show what happened in my life. So that's why I divorced, filed for divorce of my ex-wife, and I resigned from my job and I moved country. I left all behind, so no one knew really who I was, and I could just isolate completely. And that is so common. And it doesn't have to be that you move country. You can still move to a new neighborhood and just isolate. And especially from so many men I hear who do this, and if they disappear for 2 weeks, there's no one in the world who will question meeting them in person. And the pandemic, of course, with so many people working from home as well, if they had an addiction that was borderline before, when you're suddenly just working from home isolated, then it's easy, perhaps if you normally would wait until after work to have a drink, suddenly you're drinking during your lunchtime. So that also escalated a lot of these addictions, plus of course the anxiety and all the worries around the pandemic.
And it's the isolation that the business leaders are feeling in their roles that then leads them isolating themselves even more from what you're saying. That's, a key factor that will display itself in terms of withdrawing even more, perhaps.
Yeah, withdrawing more and putting in just do the job. And many of the leaders, and it doesn't have to be in Asia, if they based in Europe and they're working for an American company who also operate in Asia, then perhaps they're working in 3 time zones. Yeah. It's not uncommon to hear that people on meetings 16, 18 hours a day, and they don't tell anyone. They just join the global team, they join the boss when the boss has a meeting, because they're scared again to be perhaps the next round of layoffs. So they just want to show up everywhere, and the last thing they think about is their own well-being, both physical, mental, and emotional well-being, because of the fear of perhaps losing the job. And therefore, they become very unhealthy. And that's a common thread that we see. And that's why if you ask any psychologist or rehabs and so on after the pandemic, especially, they all, to the limit.
One of the things, Nick, that we seem to have as a common theme coming through with several guests is around identity and purpose. And I just wonder if there's a link here as well, which is, if you identify with your job and your role, and that's kind of the biggest part of your life, then if that isn't going as well, or if you lose that job, then you lose your identity and your purpose with it. So it sounds like maybe there's a link there. And also from what you were saying, you got your identity, you had multiple identities around your cycling, your swimming, your groups. It isn't just about, I am an executive. It's wider than that, which means if one part of it starts to go less well, it's not such a big impact on you as an individual at that point.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. You're touching something very important here. And this has also been the trend of the society. If we look back 20, 30, 40 years ago, everyone belonged to the local club on the corner, bowling clubs, badminton clubs, or whatever it was. And you would go there and you would spend time together. If you go back further in time, then it would be the local churches and so on. At least people had a community. And people these days don't have that, especially if we look at the younger generation. They game online, for example, and therefore they don't make those real connections, and that's a real danger. And that just means that the natural go to the default is to isolate themselves, and that is something. So I have a son who's 14 years old. He lives with my ex-wife in Sweden, and because of my own journey, I'm very much aware about this. And I now perhaps have a better relationship with my ex-wife than I ever had during the 13 years we were married, because I'm open and I can talk. I was not ready perhaps to be married then, but we can have conversations about our son in this context. I can say that, I'm concerned, and because the fact is that I'm not there on the ground, he need to have some father figures, and she has not remarried, for example. So we are together trying to find, okay, can he join the local handball team? Is there a male teacher there? Is the coach a male? So he has some role models to look up to. So he come there and also meet some of the older boys and learn to deal with emotions around real people. Because otherwise, it will, when you come into the workplace later on, it'll be a shock to the system if you haven't had those people around you.
Yeah, we definitely see that, don't we, Mark, in terms of a shift in exposure, attitudes, exposure to other people and being able to communicate, and attitudes to that of, some people of the younger generation, because like you say, that they're gaming, whatever it might be. And also through COVID as well, they've had tough times that have completely shifted the way they've grown and developed, haven't they? And I think we've got a real important role to, like you say, be really on it in terms of, are they actually engaging with people outside of those activities, to make sure that they are rounded and having those avenues to go down, really.
Yeah, it's very complex and it's difficult for parents to understand it. And I just recently heard a story of one family who had a teenage daughter, and when the boyfriend broke up with her. If we go back, perhaps when we were in high school, then there might be 2 or 3 people who would find out. But now, then perhaps the boyfriend would list her, block her on social media, make some posts tagging people, and it goes full circle. So when she's coming back to school the next day, perhaps the whole school knows about it, and that is, it's a completely different perspective. It's something that we're not used to deal with. And how do you deal with that as parents? It's very, very challenging.
Yeah. I know what my mum would have said to me: sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That was in the 70s and 80s. That was, that was a really common phrase which was used, wasn't it? And I'm not trying to belittle the topic, but maybe we just need to get more emphasis back on that, which is, it may be embarrassing, it may make you feel really bad, but it's not going to break your bones, and maybe we just need to keep reinforcing those kind of messages. But then equally, it can break your emotional bones, can't it? So maybe that was too simplistic, and my mum needed to refine her emotional response to me back in 1981 or whatever it was.
Maybe that's why you're how you are.
Yeah, exactly, Mark. And I think it's a beautiful thing of your mom to say that. And I'm having similar conversations now with my son. It's been many times he want to change school over this. He want to change or drop this subject, change this activity. As soon as there's some emotion, a negative emotion, the go-to is to drop or stop or change. And that's why it's important to slow down and have a conversation, which we have a beautiful conversation now. And I probably would not have had this honest conversation with my son if I had not gone through this journey myself. But he is very aware that he can talk to me about it, and his mom. And we have also a third party, a coach who is specialized in children, who he had about 4 or 5 sessions with. When he have something very challenging on his mind, he can let us know that he want to talk, and then we get a third party who can have a conversation with him about this.
Yeah, it's a tough gig, isn't it, being a parent, and knowing, you need to. I've got an 18-year-old daughter. She's about to go off to university at the weekend, so I need her to be resilient enough to be able to deal with, life not being as smooth as we might like it to be. But there's such an intrinsic part of me that just wants to protect her and take all the horrible stuff away. And it's so hard, because if you do that, you're not helping them either. So it's a tough balance to achieve, and really tricky.
But sharing our own stories is so valuable, isn't it? And one of the things, Becky, you and I have tried to do with our teams is, I think it's easy for people coming through their careers to look at people who they perceive as being successful and just assume that, well, it was easy, it was all plain sailing as you went through your career. You were obviously really good, and that's why you achieved what you achieved. And Becky and I are very open with our teams about our journeys through our career progression. Some of the things we're less than proud of that we achieved, some of the knockbacks we had, and it wasn't plain sailing, and there was failures along the way as well. And just, I think, just dispelling some of that, because when you're looking at other people, it's so easy to just assume that it was all plain sailing for them and everything was wonderful. and knowing that it's not, and it's okay for it to not be, you can still be successful even if things go wrong along the way, because they will go wrong. It's almost guaranteed. And maybe we need to share more of those. Well, it comes back to your point, Nick, about vulnerability, doesn't it? It
Yeah.
shows that it doesn't have to be perfect to get where you want to get to in life. It can be a real zigzaggy journey from A to B.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a saying in the 12-step programs, it's a program of, it's not the program of perfection, it's about progress. And that is hammered home the whole time, because many of people who end up in recovery means that they've been striving for perfection. And perhaps we also touched a little bit on this before about the ego, and many senior executives and especially CEOs perhaps have an overinflated ego that need to be deflated, and that's a painful journey. In the recovery world, that means that accepting that you're not the center of the universe, perhaps accepting that there's something bigger than you out there. You don't have to try to hammer in a religion, and that is not the purpose of 12-step programs, but at least it's a spiritual program where you understand that you're a part of something bigger. And if you believe that you are the circle of the universe, which perhaps some of the big founders of some of the biggest companies have felt they might have achieved miracles, but how well have they been internally? And for us executives and deadly people, that is not a good place to be. And that's where I see some of the top CEOs, and they have the heaviest crashes. And sadly, we lose quite a few of them because they just don't come out alive out of it.
I mean,
It's
ego
tragic.
is a huge area, isn't it? And it's something which we've all, at the end of the day, ego has kept us alive as a species, hasn't it? It's part of our survival mechanism. But as you say, it's when it gets overinflated, it becomes a real problem as an executive, because you set the bar too high for yourself, and then you alienate yourself and cause more isolation, probably. And it was just making me reflect, as you said, years ago, I was driving into the office one day and I was listening to, I don't know, like Kerrang radio or something, and they were interviewing Corey Taylor, the lead singer of Slipknot, the sort of extreme metal band. And they said to him, like, you're a worldwide rock star. How do you not let it go to your head? How do you keep on a level plane? And he clearly had issues from his childhood, and lots of mental health troubles, and attempted suicides when he was in his teens. And then he achieved this greatness. And they said, how do you keep your ego at bay, basically? And he said, I look in the mirror and I say, Corey, suck it up, mate. Suck it up, campers. Get on with it. And he just, it was his little phrase to himself to keep himself grounded. And I thought, what a great way to, having that little mantra to yourself when you catch yourself doing it. And off the back of that, the executive team that I was the lead partner of, I relayed this story to them, and we had little signs in our management meetings after that laid on the table which said, "Suck it up, camper, get over yourself." So if anyone started to really get their ego out in the meeting, everyone had permission to just hold the plaque up. Nothing was said. It was just we held the plaque up, and then everyone laughed about it in the end, and it really diffused a lot of situations, and it really helped all of us manage our egos in the management meetings. But it was just listening to things and coming up with little ways to kind of, because it can get very serious in business sometimes, and it just took the edge off some of those meetings at times.
I love that. Thanks for sharing that, Mark. And that is indeed something that we discuss with the executives. And if you look at, social media and so on, and in the business world, perhaps it's LinkedIn who is the very important one. And people will spend a lot of money on getting their profiles right, getting on speaker panels, and, doing all the things in order to look the very best. And for many of them, it is indeed the ego that is then being inflated. And many of them is not talking about what we are doing today, being exposed and being vulnerable, but trying to be the very best. And perhaps what everything that is said might not be what is really happening behind the scene.
It's like you say, it's that striving for perfection all the time, isn't it? And feeling like we've got to live up to a bar that perhaps we've set ourselves or has been set for us. But I think we should be challenging that, shouldn't we? In terms of, is that where the bar should be? Good enough is good enough as well. Yeah, I mean, I see that. I've seen it in several people. That real striving for perfection all the time can drive people in a very positive way sometimes, but then there's a very fragile tipping point, isn't there, where it can go very wrong. you've been very open and honest with us, Nick, about your journey and also the work that you're doing now. Have you got anything that you could share with us as we sort of draw to a close, really, around how we might recognize in ourselves when things have reached a point that we really need to do something?
Yeah, certainly. And I very much have enjoyed the conversation as well. I hope that some of the listeners have picked up something that is important to them or their loved ones, because this conversation might not be for the ones who's listening, but they might have a partner, a family member, a friend, or a colleague who is suffering in isolation because, as we said, they might be hiding it. And one thing that I would like to say is that you don't have to necessarily go and spend a lot of money to join a mastermind group or a peer group to have these conversations. But when you have the feelings of pain, when, for example, there's something bothering you, when you cannot sleep well, or you're feeling not so well, when you're taking a sick day, you're not really sick, but you just don't want to be connected with people, that's when you need to get out the pen and paper and write down what that is. And that is what the first thing in my book, Executive Loneliness, is just that, taking stock. It's about being honest to yourself about what's going on in your life. And then once you've written down what it is, the next step is to ask for help. Think about, who can I speak to about this? There's so many confidential therapists, psychologists, doctors who can go on a Zoom meeting where you don't have to be seen by anyone. You can book this in for the evening in your own time, or in the lunch break, for example. So you don't have to disclose yourself, which was perhaps before the pandemic a bit of an issue. That is not there anymore. So reach out. There's so many confidential groups there. There's so many charities, so many hotlines with volunteers. And that's a big part of what I'm doing now, giving back to people. And I'm working daily with people who are falling into alcoholism now or other addictions, and sharing my story and some tips how to get out of it. So yeah, keep talking to each other and acknowledge the issues and just ask for help. That's what I could recommend.
Nick, thank you. Such valuable advice. And thank you for being open and honest with us. We said when we were talking before recording that that's how it would be, and we really appreciate that honesty. Absolutely, I agree. I think our listeners will have gained huge value from that, and hopefully you will have helped someone, whether, like you say, it's a listener or someone they know. And ultimately that's all we can hope, isn't it? Moving on to our stock questions that we do have to ask at the end of each show. Given everything we've talked about, have you got 3 podcasts, books, YouTube recordings, something that you would recommend to our listeners that they engage with to really understand more around this area, perhaps, or that have really helped you?
Well, if they want to check out my book, Executive Loneliness, it's available on Amazon, Kindle, and so on. It's also available as an audiobook on Audible. I know many executives and so on prefer to listen perhaps at the gym. So you can go to Barnes & Noble, so Amazon, and Executive Loneliness with Nick Jonsson. So that could be one way to find out more. Otherwise, I also have a LinkedIn page, again, Nick Jonsson, NickJonsson, or a website where people can also connect with me, and it's nickjonsson.com. So those would be the best ways to reach me, and I'm looking forward to hearing from some of the listeners.
Yeah, so the final question, Nick, and thank you so much for being generous with your time with us this morning. The final question, if you could go back in time, and our normal question is an 18-year-old Nick, you may wish to choose a different age given the journey that you've been on. If you could go back in time to a point, what 3 bits of advice, pearls of wisdom, would you try and impart on a younger self?
Well, it's certainly probably even earlier than 18 years of age. I can remember clearly at the age of 14, I couldn't deal with my emotions. I don't think I was told by anyone how to deal with emotions. And at the age of 14, it was screaming or being angry or getting riots. Later on, I found alcohol to use for that. So I would like to go back to that stage and, seeking some help already there to learn how to deal with my emotions, how to play it out when something didn't go to my plan, and to be more honest and open about it already. But it's not easy said for a teenager, but that's where it all started. I can clearly remember it was at the age of 14.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, and it's really interesting, isn't it? I think we put 18 in there, but as you say, everyone if they reflect on their own lives, we're all going to have certain points where we think, do you know what, there was a big crossroads there, and if I could have and if I could have done something different then. But then knowing that, it's almost like, well, what could we now do to help other 14-year-olds, who are within our spheres, to help them, because there's going to be 20% of them who haven't exactly the same thoughts, processes, challenges that you were having as well.
Absolutely. Sounds like we have a conversation, a big one for another day as well here.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, Nick, thank you again for being so open and honest with us, generous with your time. We'll definitely include all of your details in our show notes. Yeah, we absolutely look forward to hearing more about all of the great work that you're doing as well. But thank you very much.
That was Ben. As Becky said, thank you for being so open with our listeners. If this touches one person deeply and one person does something different off the back of this, then it's been absolutely worth the time and effort to put this out there.
Thanks, Becky, and thanks, Mark.
Well, Mark, that was fascinating in so many ways, wasn't it? And just thought-provoking, such important issues there. As always, we like to summarise a few key points that have really resonated with us. So would you like to kick off with your first one?
Yeah, thanks, Becky. As you say, it was a serious conversation around a very serious topic, wasn't it? And I think there's a lot we can all take away from that. I think the first thing which really jumped out for me, and I was scribbling it down as Nick was saying it, was the phrase he came out with, which is, "You are only as sick as your secrets." And I think so really the whole concept of that point is, the more we hold in, it's toxic, isn't it? You hold in this stuff which is worrying you, causing you angst. It's toxic, and it's going to eat away at you from the inside. And we all know that even trivial stuff, if we share it with someone, we're always like, oh, wow, that was a real weight off my mind. And I can't imagine what it must feel like for what we perceive as really big stuff, which is kind of being held inside. So yeah, for me, that whole thing of, letting it out, talking to people, finding the safe place to do it in is just so important.
Yeah, I completely agree. For me, I mean, we can't not mention it really. It was mentioned so much in that discussion, is about the vulnerability piece. And we've talked about this in other episodes as well, but it is absolutely key, isn't it? We do need to demonstrate vulnerability. We need our teams to see that it's okay to be vulnerable. And for me, it's about being authentic. We show up and we lead, and we need to be setting the mood. But if we can't be fake with that. We have to absolutely be true to ourselves and make it okay for our teams to be authentic as well, and bring their true selves to work. So for me, that's such a key piece about the contents of this discussion, but also in our roles as leaders in every aspect, really.
Yeah, and I know we've said this quote before, but the Oscar Wilde one, you might as well be yourself because everyone else has already taken. So
Yep.
Being authentic, as you say, is so important because it's who you are. Yes, you can have different versions of yourself as you go through life, but it's still you, and it's about being authentic. And as you say, to really demonstrate that, you have to show vulnerability, otherwise you're not being the real you. I think the third point, which is probably very much linked to that, was bit where Nick was talking a lot about the 12-step program and the big focus on one of the steps around ego. Because I think, ego and vulnerability do not go hand in hand particularly, do they? Because, if your ego is like, the size of a planet, it's quite hard to be vulnerable, because the ego is going to stop you being vulnerable. So I think the two interacting with each other is really important, isn't it? Just find ways to, be self-aware. And there's all times where, we know we're being a complete arse, and it's actually our ego which is talking, and being able to go, I'm sorry, Becky, that's just my ego. I'm being a complete arse. Sorry about that. I think that's really important, because it's important for the other person to, because the other person, you're going to know when my ego's kind of rearing its ugly head and is out there. The only person who maybe doesn't know is me, isn't it? And if I've got that self-awareness, if I can just take that ego down, it just stops that whole cascade, doesn't it? Because we know what it's like. You don't want to be wrong at that point. Your ego won't let you be wrong. And it just cascades and causes even more like angst and pressure and stress, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, it's just being self-aware, isn't it? It's not just being self-aware, it is being self-aware. We have to have that check on ourselves. And a lot of what he was talking about was self-awareness, wasn't it? And we need to be able to recognise those aspects about ourselves when maybe things have changed. So Again, three great takeaways there. Thanks, Mark. And, such important topics. As we said, all of Nick's details will be in the show notes, as will anything else that we've referenced. And we would absolutely recommend that you do take a look at his website to find out more about what he's doing. We're also going to include there access to other resources, including the Samaritan. So if anything today has affected you, resonated with you, and you do need to reach out, please do so. If you don't already, please follow us on your chosen platform. Rating us 5 stars on that platform really helps other people to find us, and we'd really appreciate it. As I said, links to everything will be in the show notes, including a link to our website and our sponsors, Larkin Gowan. Without them, this would not be possible. Larkin Gowan Chartered Accountants and Business Advisors are there to help you and your business. Please take a look at their website. We will be back next week, and don't forget, in the meantime, be kind to yourself and boost your health, wealth and self.